Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. This morning in Dewan Rakyat, opposition leader Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim said that it shouldn't be assumed that Budget 2021 will receive the full support in Parliament if it isn't amended. Now, he was the first lawmaker to debate the budget this morning, during which he said, quote, "We are asked to support Budget 2021 on the assumption that this will be a COVID-19 budget. In my opinion, we will only support this if this is indeed a COVID-19 budget. In its current form, there are just too many questions over income projections, COVID-19 allocations and dodgy accounting." End quote. Now, quite interesting, Sharaad, because according to some comments, I know he seems to think that this is a misleading budget, that it is not a COVID-19 budget.
Well, I guess, depending on which side you are of the aisle, you might argue that it is or isn't, because there is no standard definition of what a COVID-19 budget would look like, or a common understanding of what it looks like. And when there were those calls a couple of weeks ago to support the budget from His Royal Highness, there was at that point no clear understanding of what this might mean. And so what we see now is, in fact, the government of the day's idea of what a budget addressing the particular the pandemic as well as the economic crisis should look like.
So you reckon that this is merely, mismanaged expectations or misalignment of expectations, that one side of the aisle seems to have been expecting something else and the other proposing something else. I do want to point out that, I think what will be interesting is not just seeing what happens on the other side of the aisle, but what happens on the same side. So the component parties of Berita Nasional, the parties that support Berita Nasional, whether they think that this is in fact a COVID-19 budget, whether they are happy with this budget.
Well, so the unhappiness is expressed not just over the specific measures addressing the pandemic and the recession, but overall. So you look at James Massing from Sarawak, who's of course part of the GPS, which supports the Berita Nasional government. He's come out to say that the allocation to Sarawak is reminiscent of colonial times, or of a colonial relationship. And very interesting, because he had a bit of pushback and saying, well, if you do the math, each state has been allotted a fair share. But his point is that Sarawak is not simply a state within the Federation. It's one of the 3 founding territories, and its contribution to the national economic pie is substantial, and they're not getting back as much. The question is, will GPS shift its support in protest against what they feel is a lack of an allocation, or a substantially reduced allocation, something they were expecting would be enhanced? I'm curious to know how UMNO MPs will be, debating or thinking about this budget, because again, there's been some controversy about the JASA allocation. Supreme Council member of UMNO, Buat Zakarshi, said that in fact, he had led JASA before it was disbanded in 2018, and he said he actually raised questions whether Bersatu was planning to use JASA to bolster the party in order to compensate for its lack of grassroots support. Essentially, JASA serving Bersatu the way it had served UMNO in the past. And I thought that was quite curious. I'm going to be looking out to see whether UMNO is going to support this budget. But Melissa, questions do you think that at this point in time, UMNO can afford actually destabilize the government of the day? So we understand time when the federal opposition says it might not support this particular budget, it was always, as it were, in that realm already, right? A possibility of not supporting budget, because along with not supporting the specific thinking behind this budget, it's also a kind of no confidence vote on the government of the day.
Right.
But will UMNO do that? Because what they risk is, in fact, destabilize the government. That's brought them back into power in many ways. And also, and I think this is actually a concern shared across the aisle, and a PKR MP had mentioned this, that by failing to help this budget go through, do they risk actually putting a lot of Malaysian lives in jeopardy, or at least putting help for them on hold?
All right, well, that's something we're going to be keeping a very close eye on as the budget is debated in Dewan Rakyat over the next few days. But let's take a quick look at other news. This we would like to highlight on the show. 6 more members of the Association of New Youth have been summoned for questioning in relation to a Facebook post concerning the Agong's role in the bid for emergency rule. Now, the article is currently being investigated under the Sedition Act, and we have groups advocating for freedom of expression. They've already called out for Malaysian authorities to end the harassment on the student leaders. It's been reported that the AWANI leaders have had their homes raided, they've been harassed, cyberbullied, even threatened online.
Yeah, you know, it comes back to some standard issues of the kind of authoritarian culture that we live in. One is an intolerance of dissent or views that are not shared by, by the majority. So that's one issue. But also, I think the way in which the royal institution is held in esteem, but in a way that maybe forecloses many important conversations, conversations that have been opened, that have been extended by politicians and writers, sociologists. We think of Syed Hussein Ali's books on the royal institution. Also, Zaid Ibrahim, who in his book Ampun Tuanku really outlines a very powerful argument for the constitutional role of the monarchy and the threats to it. One of it being, if the monarchy extends itself beyond the constitution, or at least members of the monarchy do that, then they themselves jeopardize the very institution which is their life force. So he makes his, I think, a very important argument in that book, a book that was widely read for a period, I think some 5 years ago. Okay, well,
it's very curious that the Sedition Act is being used. Again, as I mentioned, the groups who advocate for freedom of expression, they are saying that, expressing legitimate or academic opinion or weighing in on the news, they shouldn't put these student leaders as a target. They shouldn't be targeted for that. And you're absolutely right, Sharaad. It really is about the way we express our criticism, how we receive it as a country. Do we want to be a country that is unable to receive or think about critically certain critiques and discussions? Yeah,
there's this very interesting power distance index, discussion. And that Malaysia actually does very badly on it, meaning that we
have the highest power distance,
distance, score, which means that Malaysians by and large accept the uneven distribution of power in society, defer to those in authority, and so the whole question of blind loyalty and the demands for blind loyalty perhaps resonate with a lot of individuals in this country. They actually accede to it. They think, oh yes, of course, we have to bow to those in authority, and we shouldn't ask questions. Of course, the media and a good segment of Malaysians don't share those attitudes, and therefore we have these tensions in society.
Sure. All right, we're going to take a quick break on the show, but after this, let's take a closer look at that decision to extend and widen the CMCO. Does the data justify the extension? Coming up in a few minutes, stay tuned.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face mask, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal. Kesemuanya amat penting untuk pastikan pandemik ini dibendung.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. The Conditional Movement Control Order has now been enforced in all states in Peninsular Malaysia except for Kelantan, Perlis and Pahang, effective today until December 9th. Now, critics are asking if this decision is based on sound reasoning and scientific evidence. Joining us on the show tonight to discuss this further, we have Dr Musa Nordin, consultant paediatrician at KPJ Damansara Specialist Hospital. Dr Musa, now you've argued that the data from the Ministry of Health statistics in the public domain don't seem to justify the extension and the widening of the CMCO. Help us understand your position.
Hi, Melissa and Sharaad. Before I answer, can I make a few disclaimers? One, I'm not a public health physician, neither am I an ID, infectious diseases physician. I am probably what you would describe as a skeptical pediatrician, probably very much like my little patient, much too noisy. So, I would challenge the data of the Ministry of Health as is made available by them in the public domain. First, we look at the incidence rate, which is the total COVID cases per 100,000 population. We don't deal with absolute numbers. We deal with a proportion of the population. And if you look at the graph that I gave to you, Melissa, only Sabah and Labuan would merit the consideration of an MCO because the incidence rate in Sabah was 6 times that of the Malaysian national rate, whilst in Labuan it was 5 times. Meanwhile, the rate in the Klang Valley, namely in Putrajaya, Selangor and KL, were much lower than the national average. The national average was 2.5. KL was 0.6. PJ, Putrajaya was 1.3 and Selangor was 1.6. So it does not make sense. If you want to do CMO based on data, then you should be doing it on Penang. Penang was 2.41, still lower than the Malaysian national average, 2.5. Negeri Sembilan was 1.6, in fact, bigger than Selangor, but still lower than national average. So just looking at the data, there was no scientific rationale for an MCO.
All right, so if the scientific data doesn't seem to suggest the need for a CMCO, why do you think there was a CMCO announced?
Well, I am very much disturbed by the science or the lack of science, or what I would say the politically nuanced approach towards our pandemic crisis management of our beloved nation. If I may emphasize another factor, which is the infectivity rate. These are the active cases of COVID per 1,000 population. Yeah? If you look at the data from the national average, it is 0.4 per 1,000 population. Selangor is 0.29. Putrajaya is 0.29. KL is 0.1. So it does not make any scientific nor business sense to lock down the Klang Valley. And if you look at the trends, KL has flattened. It has plateaued, right? Meanwhile, if you look at Putrajaya and Selangor, it has slowed down. It has decelerated. Therefore, there is no scientific rationale for a continuation of another 4 weeks of economically destructive CMCO.
Dr. Musa, you know, if you look at the last 7 months or so in terms of the crisis, the public health crisis management strategies, we did have in the early part, very targeted, approaches where you had a very intense lockdown and a thorough testing of the population, a small population. It could be a condominium, it could be a part of PJ, for instance. We seem to have moved away from that to this much more, a broader approach, a blunter tool, if you like. What do you see in terms of the trends in management that you think are either positive or negative?
I will make 2 points on this, Sharaad. Number one is the use of the MCO or CMCO is what I would describe as brutal tools. Right? They are supposed to be last desperate tools to reduce the overload of COVID-19 cases. They are not the first option. Yeah? We do not end an outbreak with a lockdown. We do not exit an outbreak with a lockdown. So that's why when I read in today's Star papers, which says that, which the MOH says that CMCO is needed to preserve green zones, I say, hello. It's not meant to do that. It's not meant to end the transmission. It will never do that in the absence of a vaccine or of therapeutic medicine. It is meant to buy some time, to protect our healthcare facilities, to ensure that the infrastructure, the equipments are not overwhelmed, to ensure that our healthcare workers are well enough, rested enough to continue the battle at the front line. So it must be used tactfully, judicially, and as a last desperate tool. Second point I'd like to make after this brutal lockdown is that the tools that are being used are old tools. I am suggesting 2 things. Number one, we need to be using more mass surveillance of testing. Ours are presently very targeted. The disease is sporadic in Sabah. It is unlinked. It is right in the middle of the heart of our community. So we need mass testing. And we need to do mass testing with rapid test kit antigen. The Ministry of Health is still using PCR. PCR takes anything between 1 to 7 days with this rapid test kit, which are being sponsored by the WHO at $5 US per kit. You can get results within 1 to 4 hours. So it is a paradigm change from targeted testing to mass testing, from PCR to rapid testing antigen kits.
Dr. Musa, this has been, suggested over the last couple of months, increasing testing. Why do you think there's a reluctance to go down that road?
I think you must ask the Ministry of Health that. I have been very noisy about antigen testing, rapid testing, and this is not new. This is actually, in a way, it's a new science. It was first recommended by our colleagues in Harvard University, in particular, Professor Michael Mina, an epidemiologist, is still pushing for it, and I'm one of his mentees, trying to make sure that Malaysia gets on board this new science. The RTK, rapid test kit antigen, is an excellent test for contagiousness, for infectivity. So you should be able to diagnose a person who is positive within a space of 2 to 4 hours. Immediately at the point of care, you can isolate him. You can trace his contacts and you can quarantine them. So you get a very rapid response and a very rapid way towards ending the outbreak.
Dr. Musa, we're going to have you stay on the line. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but we'll be back with more, so stay tuned.
Masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19, social distancing, face masks. Follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal. Kesemuanya amat penting untuk pastikan pandemik ini dibendung.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S, iaitu kawasan yang sesak,
Hi, thanks for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Dr Musa Nordin, consultant pediatrician at KPJ Damansara Specialist Hospital. Now, Dr Musa, you said that you based your argument about the extension of the CMCO not being justified, basing it on MOH's statistics, MOH's publicly available data. Is it possible that the Ministry of Health has other data or has more disaggregated data that can justify this decision?
Well, if they have the data, then show us the data. In God we trust, everything else we audit. So then you can know and verify and validate the data, right? So, but even with whatever data that's available in the public domain, if you analyze the data, your rationale for lockdown does not hold.
Well, the Minister of Health, Dr. Adam Baba, has said that data sharing has been limited because to avoid the risk of contradictory or variable interpretations of data by various agencies that could possibly lead to public panic and because of the information delivered. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I'll just say that because of you withholding the data, you have created a public panic. So I would encourage you to share your data so that your scientific basis and rationale for locking down the country with CMCO can be accepted by the layperson and by the public health physician and by guys like me.
Dr. Musa, because we know that you've gotten into trouble over the last couple of years for being very vocal, at least the last year rather, for being a dissenting voice, as you noted earlier. I wonder if we could just turn our attention away from the CMCO to the question of the budget and the expectation that this budget would address the public health crisis specifically, but also the public health system in the long term. What do you make of the kind of priorities that this government has in terms of supporting the Ministry of Health?
I'm not big on budget, but my understanding of what has been made public is that the budget for 2021 gives an extra 4% to the previous year, but come and think of it, it's actually much less than what was the increment in 2019, I think 6%, and 2020 was 7%. But our request for the Ministry of Health is that we should target at least 4% of the GDP. The highest that we've had was about 2.2% in 2003. Last year we had 2.1%. This year is probably, by calculation, just only 2% of the GDP. So we're only halfway there. We are not investing in the health of our nation. So
Right.
This, I thought, was an excellent opportunity with the pandemic for us to invest in health, right? Especially in public health. If you look at the trend, tertiary care and secondary care has overtaken primary health care. That is not a good priority. If you're really thinking in terms of public health, then you need to give emphasis on primary health care.
I'm just wondering, because, you know, that there seems to be a little bit of a disappointment over budget 2021. Some critics have pointed out that it doesn't seem to reflect long-term thinking about healthcare. You pointed that out as well. But Malaysian healthcare, the Malaysian Healthcare Coalition, they made a point. They pointed out that this budget seems to be a collection of temporary fixes. I'm wondering, Dr. Musa, whether that is precisely what the pandemic needs right now. We need to have a lot of temporary fixes to fix what has already been broken before we can think about the long term. What do you think?
As it is, our healthcare has got a huge gap when we compare with our comparators in Singapore, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and Korea. If you look in terms of our doctors per population ratio, our nurses per population ratio, we are well behind. If we talk in terms of our beds per population, critical beds per population, clinic kesihatan per population, we are behind. So there is a need for us to catch up. So we expected that from this budget. It was not forthcoming. And now we are slapped with a pandemic, and even then we are not getting enough for the pandemic crisis management.
Dr. Musa, what would you like the public to be attentive to? Many of us think that many of these issues require specialist knowledge, and that even a smart person might not be able to assess the trade-offs that are being made at this point in time. What do you think the public should be focused on? What kinds of arguments do you think they should disregard? What should they, in fact, take on board when looking at the way we're dealing and talking about public health?
Well, I listen to them every day in my clinic. A mom walks into my clinic with her 3-year-old and says, Dr. Musa, my child is behaving very, very strangely. I think he is missing his friend. So I'm telling to the Minister of Health, your hashtag stay at home, you tell that to my child. For the kid, it is hashtag play outside, hashtag school, hashtag friends. MOH every day at 5 o'clock says hashtag stay at home. Come on, man. It doesn't appeal to the mother nor to the child. And then this guy comes into my clinic and says, Dr. Musa, before this pandemic, I was doing 6K a day in my restaurant. Today, if I can make 500 ringgit a day, I beruntung lah. Come on. Man. So, and then just think what's happening with our B40 kids, yeah, whose only filling meal is the breakfast in school, which Dr. Mazli made possible. Now they're probably and definitely malnourished and becoming more stunted. And now the guys in Lahad Datu, they're protesting for the MCO to be lifted. Beras tak cukup, lauk dah habis, susu anak dah habis, bantuan lambat sampai. These are issues, real issues on the ground, which I hope the guys up there in heaven can see and feel.
So what is your concern, Dr. Musa? Are you worried that by not addressing these issues, that public health measures that's put out at the federal level will not, or will be met with suspicion, will not be trusted, or will not be complied with? Is that your concern?
Well, my concern to start with is that the guys were coming up with the SOPs every day at 5 and 6 o'clock. They need to be exemplary of the SOPs. They need to walk the talk. They say don't have mass gatherings, and yet politicians come together to make political decisions. And then they say we have to be very careful and prudent. And then you get these guys in the East, you know, paying extra salaries and allowances to their EXCO members. This is the discrepancy. This is the double talk. This is the double standard happening in the nation. And if you don't see this in our leaders, then I think we are in for a bad time. Bad deal.
All right. Dr. Musa, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight and sharing your insights. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night, folks.